Welcome, everyone. This is the Great Falls Citizens Association Town Hall meeting. As you see, the title of our program is on the screen, Our Neighbors' Voices on Racial Experiences. I am Bill Canis. I'm the president of GFCA, and we welcome you all to this program tonight. There are roughly 70 people participating in this program tonight, and we are very pleased, not only with the wonderful speakers that we're going to hear tonight, but also with your participation from the Great Falls community. First, just a little background. GFCA has been a nonprofit group in Great Falls for 52 years, working to give our residents a voice with decision makers at the county, state, and federal level. And in addition to our committees that work on land use and zoning issues, trails, transportation, environment, and parks, all very specific issues often which are affected by government regulation that we want to be involved in. We also have forums from time to time to educate residents on really important topics. And this is one of those types of town halls. The last one we had was back in February, before COVID. It's hard to imagine and remember that time, but nonetheless, there was a time before COVID, and in February, we joined with Rotary Great Falls to put on a similar educational program on the opioid crisis. And it wasn't just a national look, it was a look very closely at the data for Northern Virginia and Great Falls. We had a resource officer from Langley High School, for example, who came and talked about children and their involvement with opioids. So this is part of a long process we have of bringing important topics to our community. Tonight's forum is in that same vein, and it's going to be one that we're going to hear from 5 of our neighbors. So often our speakers are government officials, but tonight we have a very unique program where 5 of our residents and neighbors and people who work in our community are going to be our speakers tonight. And I hope that this unique format will be one that all of you welcome and respect as we move forward. Tonight's program's goal is to explore kind of the living experiences of race and the difficulty of sharing conversations on racial experiences. No one has to be told why we're doing this at this time, I don't think. Since May, there have been many protests around the country. There's been a re-examining of some of our priorities around the country. And as part of that reappraisal, I've noticed in the newspaper many interviews with prominent Black Americans who have said things that, to me as a white man, were somewhat surprising. So in an article a few weeks ago about the new head of the US Air Force, a Black man, Charles Brown, who is the first Black man to serve as head of any of the US military services. In his long interview about his career path, he mentioned that when he was much younger in a squadron of pilots, obviously he was in the Air Force, he was the only Black man. And some of the others in the squadron would, or at meetings he would go to, would question whether he was even a pilot. He found that quite unusual. Or there is Raphael Bostic, who is the head of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Board. And in another interview with him about some of the priorities and issues he's following through the Federal Reserve System, he said, when you are a Black man, there's just a bunch of things that are going to happen. It's kind of hard to see a white person having that kind of statement. Or there is the New York physician who was profiled in the Post. He's actually a resident physician at a major city hospital. And when he leaves with his a service time done in the evening. Sometimes it's over at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he has to drive home. Anymore, he only wears his scrubs, his surgical scrubs and his scrub hat, because if he is stopped, he may be suspected for simply being on the road at 2 o'clock in the morning. And the final case I'll just mention before we move on to our program is Michelle Singletary, who is a prominent columnist for the Washington Post in the business section normally, has a consumer and economics column, I believe, which is syndicated. And in a recent column she had where she talked about her background as a Black woman, she mentioned that she was hired originally as an intern for the Baltimore Sun, which she was very happy about. But because it was part of an affirmative action program, she was deemed by other reporters at the Baltimore Sun at that time as somehow being unqualified. And other white interns who started with her were never questioned in that way. So these little vignettes tell us that there's a lot to learn. And I know some of our panelists tonight are going to think that, are we crazy? Why don't we know all this stuff already? But we don't. And so I'm delighted that they're here to have this kind of a conversation tonight. I wanted to move on with the format we're going to have. We have five attendees. They're listed on the screen there, and you see in that order, Pastor Dore, Principal Kimberly Greer, 3 residents, Salima Singletary, Matt Truong, and Sujatha Hampton will speak first, give their short bios in that order, and then we'll come back again to Pastor Dore for his remarks that he'd like to share with us tonight. After those remarks are over, we will have a question and answer period, and we will welcome questions from the audience. If you want to provide a question to us, there is a Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it right now, just float your cursor over it and it will pop up. And you may send a question to us that way. We have 2 board members around here who actually look at those questions, and they will pose those in a live fashion to the panelists. So that's what we're doing. So welcome again tonight. Thank you for making this. We have about nearly 70 people, I think, online. I don't remember if I mentioned that before. So that's why we're doing this in a webinar format. And at this point, I'd like to turn to Reverend Dore for his introduction.
Okay. I hope everyone can hear me. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Good, good. Hi, everyone. My name is Livingstone Dore, and I am originally from the Caribbean, from an island called St. Kitts, or St. Christopher, whichever you might choose to use. And I have been the pastor here at Great Falls United Methodist Church for the last 4 years. Before coming to Great Falls, I served in various areas across Virginia and Pennsylvania. So let me tell you a little bit about me. I went to school in Pennsylvania. That's where I originally lived for a while. Graduated from Lebanon Valley College and did grad school work at Drew University in New Jersey with a master's degree in divinity, majoring in history of Christianity. Before entering ministry, I worked in the banking industry for a few years, and then, of course, went back and did my master's and started off in the Methodist denomination and worked my way in the system for a number of years before finally being ordained as a minister within the denomination. I was appointed by a bishop. In case you probably might be wondering how I ended up in Great Falls. To some degree, I had no choice. I had no real say. I just go where they send me. And so when I left Pennsylvania, I ended up in Richmond, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and served in Richmond for a number of years in various parishes before getting a call and telling me I need to go to McLean. So I was in McLean for about 2 years. I served in one of our churches in McLean for 2 years. And after that, got another call, said, you need to go to Great Falls. And so here I am. In all of my experiences in the church, my parishes have been predominantly white. And so I just want you to know that my presentation is going to be coming from that background and that experience. I think I'm going to stop there, and we can say more later on.
Good evening. I am Kim Greer, the principal of Langley High School. I should say the very proud principal of Langley High School. I am originally from a small town in North Carolina, Lenore, and I really have been in Fairfax County for the duration of my adulthood. I actually was hired at a job fair by Fairfax County, and I arrived as an early hire and said I was going to try it out for a year and see how I liked it. And at this point, I have been here for over 25 years, so I think I'm still probably testing the waters. This is my 3rd year here at Langley High School, but again, I have served in a number of different buildings in Fairfax throughout the course of my career. My time here in Fairfax has been one where I've actually been able to see a lot of change in Fairfax as far as just the racial diversity and how the county, as well as the school division, has become much more diverse than it was when I arrived in the early 90s. I have served in, I guess at this point, Langley is school number, I think, 6. But I started off teaching at Key Middle School over in Springfield, Virginia, which was a very, or still is a very diverse school. A large Asian and Hispanic population, as well as African American and white. From there, I was at Hayfield Secondary over in Alexandria, Fairfax County side of it. There I taught for 3 years. I was at Key for 8 years and then moved into administration. I was at Westfield High School as an assistant principal there for 4 years, South Lakes for 1, and then Marshall High School for 6 prior to assuming my principalship here at Langley. So as far as my educational background, I was an education major, middle grades education. I received my undergraduate degree from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, my master's degree in middle grades curriculum and instruction from Virginia Tech, and then my administrative endorsement from George Mason. So I've hit, I think, a number of schools during the time that I have been here in Fairfax County. And again, this is my 3rd year here at Langley. Langley by far is the school that has the least amount of diversity, but I often say that children are children. And while they may come from different backgrounds, at the heart of it, many of their needs are still the same. So I am just very thrilled and pleased to be working in this community and being able to serve our children here within the Langley boundaries.
Thank you. Salima?
Sorry, I was waiting for you to unmute me. I am Salima Singletary. I live here in Great Falls with my husband and my 4 children, although one is off at college currently. I have 2 Langley graduates and 2 that are currently at Langley right now. Well, sort of at Langley. They're in spirit. They're at Langley in spirit right now. I am African American. My family has been here for several centuries. I grew up mostly in Annapolis, Maryland. My parents were actually in the NOI at one point when I was really little. That's kind of beyond my memory. And then we became, I guess, sort of the Worthian kind of more mainstream Muslims. I went to an elementary school that was mostly Black. There were like two white boys and like maybe three in the entire class. And we had one Asian person, Sandy Vo, I think she was Vietnamese. And my junior high school was more diverse. It was maybe 40% Black and 60-ish% white with your, you know, David Wong and Ken Bond. And that was, you know, that was pretty much it for the Asian contingent. I got married and I moved to various places in Virginia. My husband is white, so it's an interracial marriage. And I have seen, we used to get stared at a little bit. People would, you know, they're too polite to stare here. They kind of try to pretend like they're not staring, but that you don't need to pretend anymore. They just don't stare anymore. And we actually took our honeymoon in South Carolina, Kimberly. And so this was more than 20 years ago. And I remember we were at Hilton Head and I was telling my mom's cousin, and we stopped by Sierra on the way back, and I said, people looked at us like we were crazy. You know, in Northern Virginia, Annapolis, people would kind of like, I'm staring, but I'm not staring because that's rude. At Black people, white people, everyone just looked at us dead in our faces like, what are you people doing? It was, and she said, yeah, that's what people do. So I don't know if that's changed in 20 years, but the last time we were in South Carolina, we didn't, well, he wasn't there. We didn't have any staring. So I worked at a newspaper when I got out of college, then at University Press, retired when when pregnant with my first daughter, because I decided that taking 2 trains and 2 buses into DC was just not something I was prepared to do anymore from my little assistant's salary. And now I am here in Great Falls enjoying the scenery and the nice people.
Thank you, Salima. Matt Truong.
Yes, my name is Matt Truong. As you can tell from my name, I'm not Black, but I have 2 boys that graduate from Langley. I'm making fun, right? So we're laughing it up, but I have 2 boys that graduate from Langley. I think was one just recently this past year. Grew up in Pennsylvania and Lancaster, not too far from Lebanon actually. And it was one of those towns in 1986, came to the United States as a boat people with 2 pair of clothes and 2 words of English. So literally just was yes and no. And moved into a little town called Elizabethtown. We call it short, called E-Town. There were only 2 Asian families. Okay, so you know E-Town. Okay, great. There were 2 Asian families essentially. One is Vietnamese, that's us, and the other one was Laotian. The rest of it are just, again, I'm going to use the term of endearment, right? Just a bunch of rednecks. And so for me, talking about, tying in and learn the culture and all that, I had no other choice. So I grew up driving trucks, listening to music, going hunting. I don't see myself as Asian. I'm just seeing just another boy in the school in E-Town. Now, it's kind of interesting along the way. I never thought about races and all that because that's the way it is. And in fact, I did get, the funny thing was I heard some bad words. And the funny thing was at the time, I didn't know what they meant, right? But it kind of came up a couple times and the body language sounded like it was quite a little bit hostile. And I didn't think much of it until I pick up more language and English and what have you, and got to learn a little bit more about it. But I got along with a small group of friends who were eclectic. There were 2 Black kids and actually brothers. So it's really one family. And that was it. And then it's just whites and, Asian family, Laotian. And I pick up and learn quite a bit about the culture. I didn't think much about I'm different than anybody else. But I actually noticed a little bit of that with the Black, the 2 brothers there. And it didn't dawn on me of what's going on until I got to Penn State. Actually, I have a master's undergrad and graduate degree from electrical engineering. And again, when you're at Penn State in 1990 or 1986, there weren't a lot of Asians, a lot of whites. And again, bump into 2 or 3, Black kids. And we ended up hanging out and do a lot of things together because which is, that's the way it is. And for me, you know, having done 3 successful startups as well, again, the ratio kind of come up with about a small percentage. You know, there's a lot of Asians in the engineering, but Blacks there were a few. And in fact, I had some bosses that, you know, that actually I work for, and I got employees that are Blacks and other, you know, races that working for me as well. I typically don't think of it anything else. I know there's some of that where I've seen other colleagues saying something or acted differently, but I typically kind of pull them aside and say, hey, are you treating me differently than, you know, Joe or Bob or whoever it is? And it's, you know, like I said, I've never thought of it that way. I sense some of that racism. And in some cases, I also sense reverse racism from my end, where they think, well, you know, you're Asian, you must be pretty smart. And, you know, your kids couldn't go to the, you know, Yale or Harvard because, you know, they got better score, 1600 or whatever. So the way I look at it, and I'm going to stop here, I see from both sides, and sometimes I sense it, sometimes I feel it, sometimes I walk away from that because I don't think it's necessary, that's need to. But then in some cases, I do stand up for myself. In some cases, I even stand up for my friends as well, in terms of like, why are you acting this way? You don't need to, because you know, if you think that this guy is not as good as me, then what do you think of me, and vice versa? So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Matt. Sujatha, Hampton.
Hi, my name is Sujatha Hampton, and I've been a Great Falls resident since 2006. I am currently the education chair for the Fairfax NAACP. So I really do have this conversation on race often. I am from here. We came here I was born in the States. I'm Indian, by the way. I'm Indian, and I was born here in the States. And we moved to Fairfax County when I was in the 2nd grade, 7 years old. And I went to Vienna Elementary School and Kilmer Middle School. And I graduated from Marshall High School. I went to the University of Virginia for my undergrad. I got my master's in special education from GW University. So I was here, and I taught here in Montgomery County, in DC Public Schools first, then Montgomery County. I have a doctorate in special education with a focus in serious emotional disturbance and learning disabilities from the University of Texas at Austin, where we went when my husband was stationed at Fort Sam Houston. So was there for a while, came back, worked at the University of Virginia, was the Title I coordinator in Albemarle County, where Charlottesville's Albemarle County. And then came back here, wrote a novel, published that, and I have been pretty much doing activism for the last many years. I'm also your new library trustee for Drainsville. That's a new appointment. And I don't know what else. That's me, the introduction, I guess.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you everybody. That's, so I've lived next door to some people here in Great Falls, and I now know more about all of you than I know some of my neighbors next door, who we never have these types of conversations about your background and where did you come from and so on. So anyway, we want to move on now to the opening statements, the commentary period that you folks would like to address in terms of the topic tonight about racial experiences. And we want to go back to where we started with introductions with Pastor Dore.
Okay, so I'm gonna be a lot more freewheeling in what I have to say, since I don't have any particular written outline or anything. I just feel I should just speak from, from my heart and things like that. As I said, I grew up in the Caribbean, and for me, racism was never an issue until I got to the United States. And then looking back over the years about all of that, I realized the problem I had growing up in the Caribbean was not a race, but a class issue, right? And that is a whole different matter than racism. By that I mean, you in the Caribbean, if you don't know anything yet about the Caribbean, and by the way, it's a beautiful place to go. So I would encourage you to do that. You might even want to stay. That's something, you know. But in the Caribbean, there are a number of wealthy people who are Black. You would not believe that, but they are. And so for us, that was the issue, a class type of thing, right? So you have some very wealthy Blacks, some very poor whites. We live next door to each other. It's a small island, so there isn't nowhere to go unless you go to the mountains to get away from one another. So you learn to grow up and look beyond race. And I've heard that same thing from even some of the white folks that I've grown up with who have moved to places like the United States or even Canada, who for them, race was suddenly a big thing, even though they're white, because they never had that kind of experience growing up in the Caribbean. So it wasn't until I got to college, my very first semester in college, fortunately, my roommate was had just left the Marines and came to school, and we started rooming. And of course, race was one of those things he and I spoke about a lot. Simply because, one, the school only had 5 of us in the entire student body who were not white. 5. So I was the only Black, and from the Caribbean, there was an Ethiopian, there was a South American, and an Indian, and a Chinese, and that was it. And so for the first time, I began to address the issue of race and began experiencing those kinds of issues. I remember very distinctly being asked where I'm from. And when I would tell students where I'm from, first thing they would go, "Oh, you're from Africa." No, I'm not from Africa, I'm from the Caribbean. Or the West Indies. That's how we refer to the Caribbean, as the West Indies. Or I would hear things like, "Well, how did you get here? What boat did you take?" Or "How did you guys live? Did you use a lot of bicycles?" Or you and I can now look back and laugh at those kinds of things, but those were the kinds of questions I remember getting. In fact, before I move on from that, I remember even one student was going to Washington, D.C. for a weekend, and that student was really upset because she came from a small town in Massachusetts and had never been to Washington, D.C. And here, I'm a new student, and suddenly I'm going to a place like Washington, D.C. And she got upset about that. So that was my eye-opener to racism. Before I transferred, I remember one afternoon walking down the street in the college town. And it was about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And as I walked down the road, up on the hill in this housing development was a kid who was walking by. And as I walk on the sidewalk, he was walking down the hill, and all he was doing was just yelling the most obscene thing at me for no reason other than he saw somebody who didn't look like him, and I was suddenly that nigger. And I listened to that all the way to the college campus, back to the college campus. I think what got me was when I mentioned it to the admission director at that time, who was also my school mentor, getting me acclimated to the environment. And she was not only stunned, but was like, well, what do I do? She had no idea how to address the issue. When I transferred to Lebanon Valley, it was a whole different situation because it was a much larger school and a lot more diverse, but it didn't mean that the race issue wasn't there. In fact, by then I was prepared for it. And fortunately, I had professors who were a lot more open-minded and actually challenged me to many degrees on the whole issue of race and social justice and things like that. All that began to change when I went to work. And so, as I said earlier, I started off in the banking sector, and suddenly, here's a Black guy who sounds different, and he's working, and I suddenly became one of the supervisors. I was the only one. And I remember one of the person I supervised saying to me, who was African-American, that I have no clue about their values, because although I am Black, they see me as one of the whites, because my values were not theirs. And that was an adjustment. That was an eye-opener as well for me. That was a discussion we had to have during that time. When I left the banking sector and went back to grad school and then came into ministry with the denomination, I again had to deal with the whole issue of race, and more so from my clergy peers than I did from the parishioners that I was going to be working with, even to this day. My very first church, parish that I went to, after 2 years, my immediate supervisor basically had to take me out of that environment and move me to a city church. And again, you got to remember, this is a whole new learning curve for me. But then I ended up in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where I served another church in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And I remember when that church found out that they were getting a Black pastor, I got a phone call to attend a very special church meeting. And I got there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I couldn't even park my car because the parking lot was full. And so I walked in, and immediately I realized what I was walking into. And of course, race was the only issue that came up in that setting. And again, I had to address it. And interestingly, I stayed at that church in Hershey, Pennsylvania for 4.5 years before heading to Virginia. I have to admit, coming to Virginia was a whole different, as we would say, kettle of fish, Going to Richmond and serving in Richmond, in the city itself, race for me then was not the issue. By then, I am mixing with folks from the Caribbean who were part of the denomination, folks who were African Americans and Hispanics. That was one of the largest minority group there. And so, the dynamics was a lot different. In fact, I remember when we did a after-school program, and English as a second language, or Spanish as a second language program. We did both, English as a second language, Spanish as a second language. And we literally had business people who ran businesses coming to the program to learn Spanish as a second language because so many of their employees were Spanish. And as one of them said to us, listen, they have a way of talking Spanish at times, and heck, I want to know what they're saying about me. So I need to learn Spanish. Race has been and continue to be an issue in my setting as a clergy person, except for, and I have to admit this, except for when I got here to McLean and to Great Falls. In fact, before I end, when I came to Great Falls, I remember meeting the leadership of the church, and race was never mentioned. Only to find out that before I got there, one of the associates was a Black woman. So I said she paved the way for me to be there. But I remember sitting over at Starbucks one morning, even before I became the pastor, and I asked one of the leaders, to be honest with me, what am I looking at? And her response was, you're coming to a community, Great Falls United Methodist Church in particular, where you're going to have a lot of professionals, and by and large, the people who are going to attend are professionals or retired professionals who are very liberal in issues pertaining to social justice, but are downright conservative whenever it comes to anything finance-wise. So you're going to have to work for your money if you need them to get involved with anything that has to do with money. That's what you're looking at. And I have to admit, 4 years later, that is quite true. I have folks who you would not believe are as liberal on issues of social justice, very strong on race relations. And that's the environment I am in, and one I have to admit that I'm enjoying. I think after being here for 4 years, they finally feel like they like me, so I get to stay. I'm gonna stop there and let the rest of you have something to say.
Thank you. Before we move on to Kimberly Greer, I just wanted to mention to the audience that you can submit questions anytime. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function. And so please don't hesitate to send questions in now. And actually, we have one right now. I wondered if the panelists might like to address that. It kind of speaks to something that Pastor Dore has brought up, and maybe this would be a relevant time before we proceed with the other statements, about have you encountered systemic racism here in Great Falls? Anyone want to take that up? And if nobody wants to speak to it, we'll move on, and Kimberly Greer will be our next speaker, but would anyone like to comment on that?
To be honest with you, I cannot say that I have. Although my church is a small church, we have about a membership of 400 people. I have, as I mentioned earlier, we have physicians, we have a lot of teachers, we have CEOs, lawyers, and so I cannot say, even in that setting, that I have in any way experienced systemic racism. I do have Asians who are part of my membership, and I also have Africans who are part of that membership. So, I cannot honestly say that I have.
Okay, anybody else want to address that? Any other panelists? Sujatha is smiling. Does that mean she doesn't want to? She wants to say something, but she's thinking twice.
I'll just wait until it's my turn. No, I have not. I mean, it depends on it depends on what you call it. So, I've got to live here, man. So I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay, we'll go on to Kimberly Greer then. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So before sharing, I will, I guess, share based upon where I currently sit as principal of Langley High School. I don't know if that's why Sujatha might have been smiling and laughing. What happened with George Floyd brought to the surface a lot of what has been boiling right under the surface of our country for a long time, and it really has come to a head over the past few years. And again, the murder of George Floyd really sent it over the edge. And so while we would like to think that at Langley High School we are immune from having to deal with issues of race, and then of course how our children may be engaging in actions that are less than desirable or in ways that we have not taught them to behave. It actually ended up being that as a result of what happened with George Floyd, there was a hypersensitivity within our school, as there should have been. And we did have a student who, as children often will do, took to social media, made use of the N-word, and it brought a large amount of attention to Langley, even though the student had done it on a personal account, on her own time, not as part of the school activity, because of course schools were closed due to the pandemic. But as a result of that, it became very clear to me and very quickly that as principal, I needed to help our community be able to address this in a manner that was going to be constructive and positive. And so what we did was we actually did host 2 town halls with a group of students serving as panelists. One was for parents and the other was for students. And what it did was it brought to light, there's a lot of pain that is being experienced by students here at Langley High School who do not fit the mold. And the mold is based upon race, but it's also based upon, sexual orientation, as well as in some cases, it may be something as based upon socioeconomic status. But there are a group of children here that Langley is not a safe space. And so as a result, the school, we came together as a staff after that meeting and had a really tough conversation as the adults, working in this building and educating our children. And it was very clear very quickly that we needed to do better and take a different path. So we at Langley are actually working on addressing this in a consistent manner throughout our school building to ensure, I'm calling it, a Saxon safe space for all, that regardless of who a child is, as they are part of our school community, they're feeling as though Langley is a safe space for them. I'll tell you, there's a lot of work to do. Our kids are fantastic. I love Langley. I love our children. By far, they are the most impressive group of young people I've ever worked with. But I also understand and recognize, as we all once were teenagers, that we have the ability to put on a different face based upon with whom we're interacting. So, while I will say maybe it's not systemic racism, there is definitely insensitivity and microaggressions that are happening within the school community that we are working to address. So I felt it was just important to put that out there because, our young people are our future. They are the next generation, and it really is up to us to show them a more perfect way if we're hoping to see that this country is going to make changes and really live up to what we're hoping it all could be based upon its potential. So with that, I will now transition back to me and what my experiences have been when it comes to race. And again, I think I'm the only person on the panel who doesn't live within Great Falls, but again, I have the pleasure of working here. As I shared earlier, I am from North Carolina, a very small town. We were up about 20,000 when I was growing up. The population has declined to about 18,000, and it was not diverse at all. Salima spoke about having, the 1 or 2, Asian families. We had one girl in our high school who was Amerasian. Her mother was Asian, her father was white. And then we had another family that moved in during my high school career, and then they promptly left. So it was a place where I wasn't necessarily used to interacting with people that were from a large number of places outside of the United States. When I thought about this whole issue of racial experiences, the first one that came to mind was being 7 or 8. And I was a Girl Scout, and, I bugged my mom about going to Girl Scout camp. I really wanted the full experience of being able to camp. And so we arrived at the camp, and it became very clear that I was the only person of color within, the hundreds of girls who were camping, and it was a week-long camp. And it was really the first time I had really felt isolated based upon race. And it was, for someone who's 7 or 8, that is jarring enough. There was one girl who befriended me. And in short order, she arrived back at her camp, after a day of us being friends, and all of her things were sitting outside of the tent. Her tent mates had basically kicked her out and stated because she was a nigger lover. So that was my introduction to, people having a different mindset and approach when it comes to interacting with people who may be traveling a different path and who look a different way. The next time I encountered, an issue based upon race was my freshman year of college. I did not put in to have a roommate of color. I felt that part of the college experience was getting to know people and being able to move beyond race and what's different, and really being able to find commonalities. And so we arrived in the room first, my family, and they're helping me settle in. And my roommate arrives, and she's white, and her family was very, very friendly. She not so much. And I guess maybe after about 2 or 3 weeks of not being in the room at all except to sleep, she comes in one day and she says to me, "I owe you an apology." And I'm thinking, did she break something? Did she take something? What's happened? And she said, I haven't been around because I don't know how to live with a Black person. And so I'm like, okay, that's sort of interesting for a couple of reasons, because, I have never been someone who basically looks at race first. It's more about who are you as a person. But the other piece is because the college actually asked on the residential form if you were comfortable living with someone of a different race. So that was really the out for someone who didn't feel comfortable living with someone who, in her case, was not white. So at the end of that semester, she left after it being a very contentious, uncomfortable situation. But again, they say that doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The flip side was, I go home for winter break, I come back, I have a new roommate. She's also white, and it was a totally different experience with her. So it just goes to say that's why it's so important that you can't allow one negative experience with one person to influence how you may then perceive an entire group of people. So, and I've jotted down a couple of I guess, themes. And the first one is I'm used to being the only one or one of a few. And so I think that's probably something the other panelists, some have already spoken about, but I think we all share that as a commonality, that when you reach a certain level, you have to be okay with being the only one. And it's something that most people who are white never will experience, because you walk into a room as the majority. And so, thinking back over my my school career, I was someone who generally was in the more advanced classes. And it's sad to say that I was the exception and not the norm. My high school was very integrated. I'd say probably it was anywhere between maybe 25 and 30% African American. But when you looked at the classes, the advanced academic classes, you would find 1 or 2 of us there. And then as I think about that as the theme moving into college, similar situation, going to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And then I think about when I moved to Fairfax County. As I said, I've been here since the 90s. And I took a job based upon the fact that an offer was made and based upon Fairfax County's reputation. And my family came up. We spent a weekend, looking at the area, decided, yeah, I'm really excited. I want to move. So my family moved me up here, and it was 1992. And I don't know if you remember the whole situation with Denny's, where there were 3 FBI agents who were suing Denny's based upon the fact that they had been discriminated against. So I moved to Fairfax City, and we actually ended up going to Denny's for breakfast and got great service, I'm happy to report. But as my family was preparing to leave, my mother looked at me and said, "Are you going to be okay?" And I said, "Why would you ask me that?" And she said, "I haven't seen anybody who looks like us." And so that's really was telling in the fact that working in Springfield, which was much more diverse, but living in Fairfax, I would venture to say it's similar to what we still see here in Great Falls. It was possible for me to go days without seeing someone who looked like me. And so I had to be okay with that in order to be okay with staying in this area. The next thing I just wanted to talk about was my first assistant principal position was at Westfield High School. And I prided myself, the look has changed, but I prided myself on the fact that I wore a suit every day for actually 4 years when I was at Westfield, changed it to dresses once I was at South Lakes. Every day for 4 years, with the exception of Fridays, I had on a suit for a couple of reasons. Don't have to worry about what you're going to wear. If you have a suit, everything matches. But it was also very important for me to project a certain image. And I recall being in the cafeteria one day, and I was doing lunchroom supervision, and a parent approached, and I'm thinking, oh, she's in need of assistance. And so I said, may I help you? And she looked at me and said, are you security? And not to say that we should ever judge someone based upon how they're dressed, but I have yet to encounter a security assistant in Fairfax County who wears a suit. And so I had to sort of let that roll off and to basically then share with her, no, I'm one of the assistant principals. And she then expressed surprise. So I would like to say that it was the first time I had encountered that type of reaction upon giving someone my title. But unfortunately, it was not the case. You know, living in North Carolina and then coming here, there have been other instances, but that was one that really stood out. The other that stood out was during Barack Obama's time in office, and it was around the time of the Affordable Care Act being debated and ultimately passed. And I was having a conversation with a coworker one day, and she was white, and she was very frustrated. And and she was ranting about Michelle Obama, and I'm like, what's going on? Why are you so upset? And she referenced a political cartoon that basically showed Michelle Obama in, I don't know if you remember this, but it was like in radical gear, and she was sort of giving Barack Obama the fist bump. And she was like, look at this is so wrong. And, and she turned around and said that for the first time in a long time, she was proud of America. How dare she say that? And it was just with this tone of frustration and disgust. And so, being a teacher at heart, I always try to find opportunities to help expand someone's understanding as opposed to just, being frustrated and walking away. And so what I shared with this coworker was the fact that we all come to a situation based upon our own set of experiences that we've lived. And when you think about Michelle Obama being a person of color, her experiences growing up in America would look very different than this coworker who was white. And I actually then shared with a coworker the story I shared with you about being at Girl Scout camp. And she looked at me and she was aghast, and she said, oh my gosh, I never knew things like that would happen. They were still happening. And I looked at her and I said, but how would you know? And why should you know? Because you have a different experience than mine. And so I think that's the other piece, is that we always need to keep in mind and remember that we can't necessarily overlay on someone else's experiences or thoughts what our beliefs are regarding how they should be responding to a situation because they've traveled a different path. And then the other thing that I would just offer is, the fact that I really believe that there are times where people don't mean harm, and yet harm still happens. And I wrote down, I have 3 children, and one has graduated from Fairfax County. She is a junior at the University of Richmond. I have a senior at Robinson and a sophomore. And there have been times that even me, during the course of their educational career, I've been in administration for the bulk of it. And I've still had to have conversations with teachers regarding how they are treating my children or experiences or opportunities that I feel as though have been withheld. And while I would like to think that it's not based upon race, when you look at patterns, it sometimes makes you wonder. And I do recall having to have a conversation with the school principal. And what I did, not angrily, but I wanted her to be aware, we always talk about data when it comes to education. And so I shared with her what were my data points, which were basically the experiences that my children had, in the school where she was leading. And, she thanked me and told me that it had given her something to think about. So in the midst of all that we're dealing with as a country, I just think it's very important that we recognize and understand two things, that we all really are members of the same country and we are going to rise or sink together. And the other piece is that our children are watching. And that's been the hardest thing with what's happened over the past 3.5 years as far as watching our government as it continues to devolve and people are no longer thinking about the greater good, but we are really dividing ourselves based upon political parties and what is in the interest of a small group or maybe one person's best interest. So I'll just stop at that, but that really is what has been my experiences so far.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thanks for giving us both your personal and your institutional perspectives there at Langley. Salima, you're next.
Okay, so I too have been like going back to my mind and thinking, what were the incidents in my life? So like I said, I have vague memories of my first elementary school, which was majority Black. My second elementary school was majority Black. We had a Black principal. I was bullied there, but it wasn't racial. I was bullied because I was from the North and I came to a small Southern town. So I was different. I was Muslim. I had a scarf on. I was bullied a little bit by Black kids, mostly by a couple of what you would call like white redneck kids. And it occurred to me, I was like, you know what? They never once called me the N-word. They just, kind of tortured me. Mostly what I experience is subtle, right? I remember being in junior high and I was in Odyssey of the Mind or Olympics of the Mind. I forget which one it's called now. There were two names at the time. And a local newspaper reporter came to, do a little local color story about it. And I remember feeling that, she's kind of cold towards me specifically. Like she's asking all the other kids questions. She's talking to Brendan, Lake, and Andrea, and she's just kind of, And then we go to take our picture, and she goes, "Oh no, you sit on the end." So I sat on the end, and the dog takes the picture, and it comes out in the paper. They've cropped me out of the picture and left me out of the article. Mm. So if you were to go back in time and scroll through the Capital Gazette, I'm in the yearbook, of course, which I was on, but I didn't exist. So it's rare, but it's usually things like that. I don't put a lot of stock into things that people don't mean anything by, because I know I've done it. I once was carpooling with a, I forget what age ethnicity she is, but her name's Phyllis, my daughter's soccer team. We were going somewhere. Somehow we got on the topic of people mistaking us. And I remember telling her about being mistaken for a girl I went to college with and meeting her and saying, "Oh yeah, Dee and I kind of look alike. We're around the same height, same face shape. I could see how people would mistake us the first 2 weeks of school." But another time being mistaken for a woman at the paper where I worked, and then she worked night shifts. So I met Marcia. I'm going, Marcia's 20 years older. She has long dreads with gray hair. She has a gap in her teeth. I close mine with braces. She has, facial moles. We look nothing alike. So we had this conversation about it, and she's saying it happens to her too. And then 6 months later, I had met someone who was Asian. It was someone she knew through soccer. And then I ran into her again a week later with Phyllis, who had this conversation with. And I thought she was someone else who was also Asian. And I could see them exchange this look like, oh, here we go. And I wanted to say, I'm just bad with faces. When I meet people, I don't always fix their face firmly in my mind. And I had this moment of pain, it's not because I can't tell Asian people apart, I just haven't fixed your face in my mind firmly. So I keep that kind of thing in mind when I'm interacting with people, that maybe they're forgetful, maybe they had a bad day. It's not always, I'm not going to make a federal case about about everything, because number one, I don't care. I'm not going to walk around with a Star Trek through the forge visor trying to detect racism everywhere. And number two, why would I miss out on the opportunities to have good relationships with people and just have a happier life by not always assuming malintent every time someone makes a mistake or a flub. So other than that, I mean, I'm not going to say that I don't sometimes experience, coldness every now and then, but it's rare. I mean, most people are perfectly nice. They're indifferently nice, hi, bye. Don't think about you after they see you. That's my general experience with people of all races. Every now and then something happens. I don't know if it's racial. All of you guys who are on next door may know that a couple of years ago, someone accused me of a crime. They took a picture of me and said that I had vandalized a political sign. And they literally said they caught me spray painting a sign in broad daylight on a Saturday. When I was taking a picture of the sign, because I knew someone on the campaign would ask me, oh, you live off this road. If you're not busy, could you take some pictures? We're trying to document this. I said, sure. So I took some pictures, sent it to him. I go about my day. And then my husband comes out and says, someone next door took a picture and says that you were spray painting signs on Seneca. So I don't know if that was racial. This person may go around accusing people of crimes all the time and stirring up trouble, but it certainly wasn't a pleasant experience. And to me, it doesn't matter if it was racial. You just shouldn't go around accusing your neighbors of committing crimes. So.
Thank you, Salima. So just cognizant of the time, it's 8 o'clock, so we have a half an hour left. So we'd still like to get in a few questions. There are quite a few interesting questions in the queue, but we want to move forward. Matt, you're next with your personal stories, and then we'll wrap up with Sujatha.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'll keep it short here. For me, the way I look at it, there are several categories, right? There are people that doesn't matter. I mean, look, this is who I am, right? And I marry a Vietnamese woman, so my kids look like me. They're full-blown Americans, and they are Americans. And yes, we're about 4.5% in the United States. So we're going to be minorities for a while, right? For a long while. So the way I look at it and the way I tell my children, it's just like the Kenny Rogers songs, right? You got to know when to hold them, and you got to know when to fold them, and when to walk away. And so you need to determine that at times to do that. There are certain times that you just like, okay, whatever, no big deal. There's time you like say, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. And there are times that you got to take a stand and say, this is not right. Why are you doing this to me or to us or whoever it is? So, but, look, racism is always there. And frankly, I'll tell you, I came from Vietnam. Racism is even worse outside the United States. So for those that live outside of the United States, you can realize that not only racism because the way you look, right, but also in terms of the class. So thank you for explaining that. So you can get multiple racism, right, because of, your economic standard and also the way you look and the way you're raised. So, case in point, if you're born in Vietnam and you're half Black, you're ostracized in Vietnam, right? The worst situation. But for me is, there's always a bias, and you give people a benefit of doubt. And, the way I look at it is, in fact, I'll tell you, I deal with a lot of technical business. I'm doing technical sales. How many Asian guys doing technical sales? And yet when I go to meetings, they always look at me and say, and when there's a technical questions, they're expecting me to answer because I look Asian. Whereas I'm the guy that's running the business, right? And actually closing deals for the companies. I'm making the decision, right? So for me, I take that as a funny, and sometimes we play on each other when we deal with a new client, because I would walk in there, talking like an engineer, and the other guy's an engineer, which happened to be white, talk like he's a business guy, and we're kind of play on it, right? And so, and we're laughing about it because when we know the customer is okay, we kind of play on that just to build a relationship with them. Racism is always there, and people saying there's none, they're lying to you, right? But how do you deal with that situation? And by the way, also there's biases, no matter what, okay? If they are not racist, they're biased. They're because you're raised, you're born, and your upbringing give you some sort of bias. For example, because I'm Asian, I must know a lot of math and I must be good at it, which is from Langley, as you know, that may not be true, right? So for me, yes, there is some of that, but you know, we don't need to get into all the fights when we can, pick and choose the battles. And yes, whether, you know, in certain situation and certain groups of people, they'll tell you your face, right? They'll call you the bad words. And then there are some people who are more subtle in that, right? So in that case, they won't tell you your face, but you feel it. And for me, that's the worst kinds, right? Because they're trying to ostracize you without ostracizing you. Whereas in some cases, I prefer that if they tell to my face, hey, I don't like you because you look different and you have an accent, whatever it is. And I'm okay with that. And my kids, you know, they speak perfect English and all that. At the end of the day, we need to, in my personal opinion, we need to tone it down a little bit. We need to recognize each other. There were some good people there. In fact, a lot of my success stemmed from white people. I was going to be an auto mechanic. My counselor, which is a white woman who didn't have to do anything for me, pull me into her office and say, you got good grades, you went for tech school, you get straight A's, you ought to go to school. She didn't have to do this. This is 1986 in E-Town, which is as white as can be, as redneck as can be. And yet she gave me the opportunity, right? My first startup the same way. I have a master's degree because of a white professor that says, hey, right? So the way I look at, yes, there are both sides, but you know, we gotta look at the left and the right and the positive and the negative, and we need to learn from it. And I'm glad that the GFCA is doing this, so that way we're be cognizant of what's going on. Perhaps there are people out there that because they're nervous, they're not sure how to interact, it gives a wrong vibe to minorities like us. And so, and yes, we're always minorities, and we need to live with it. And if you're a little bit curious and you're not sure, ask, right? We're Asian, we all look the same, by the way, Salima, right? So it's okay to say that. I know, right? Sometimes
I've done it to white people too, but those two Asian women didn't know. They were like, it's not because you're Asian, I'm just bad with faces, I'm sorry.
Right. But you know what I'm saying? So my point to you is, and to everybody else, right? I could take this the wrong way. We're not, we look individual. We don't look the same, right? But yet, you know, sometimes it's kind of, yeah, but that's okay, right? I can take it the wrong way. Or I can make fun of it and say, yeah, it's a mistake, no big deal, right? But we don't want to confront it and say, oh, you're being racist to me because I'm Asian, so we all look the same, so how dare you? And then you're picking up the fight when you don't really need to, right? That goes back to the Kenny Rogers song. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Matt. Sujatha?
I will try to be very, very short. I will just tell you maybe a story or two. Like I said, I was born here in the United States. I was born in Albany, New York. My father came here to do a postdoc. He's a chemist, he's a virologist, and he came to do a postdoc. And he came in January of 1967, and he brought my mom here. And 6 months later, when he could afford her passage, and I was born here in the States a year later. So what I can say, just like, and so that was a long time ago. I was a child in the 70s. And we moved to Silver Spring. Well, we moved to St. Louis and we moved to Silver Spring. So I was my first real memories are in Silver Spring, Maryland. And we lived in an apartment on Randolph Road. And what I can remember from those times is I was very afraid. I was afraid that someone was going to kill my dad because he was brown. I really was. I mean, I really was afraid. I was always afraid because he spoke with an accent, and I could feel, and where did I get that from? I don't know where I got that from, right? So, you know, I went to a daycare when my mom was taking, she was taking a course at the University of Maryland. She put me in this child care center where they locked me in the bathroom with this Greek girl because I was the N-word. And which I don't say because I'm not Black. So I'm Indian, and that word doesn't belong to me. And so I don't say it, but they were calling me that. And, you know, she had to go pick up her daughter from her school, and she would put us all into the station wagon, and this boy would like push my face with his foot, and he put mud all over my face. I was 3 years old, you know, and said, I can't sit next to you because you're a N-word. And I was locked in the bathroom because I was an N-word. To this day, you know, those old metal lunch boxes that have the clips that we used to have when we were kids, the smell of that, I can still, sometimes that smell will come to me, and it's a wave of revulsion and fear. And that was sort of with me all the time. When we lived in this apartment, this boy stole my bike, and they were white people. And I mean, everybody who lived in that apartment building was fairly poor. So they were white people, and he stole my bike, and I saw him steal my bike. And I went and told my dad that this boy stole my bike. And my dad, who's afraid of nothing, you know, he just says, okay, let's just go get your bike. And I can still, just telling this story right now, I can feel like that feeling, and my heart was beating like this because I thought that they were going to kill my dad. I always was afraid that these people, all of these people that didn't love us the way they loved each other. So I felt that fear all the time. They didn't love us, and they didn't love me the way they loved each other. And I was afraid. We went to Florida when my brother's 10 years younger than me. And so my grandfather had come from India. And so my grandfather, my aunt, my uncle, my dad, and I drove down to Disney, to Orlando. And my brother was just born. And so my mom and my brother stayed behind. And so here we are, all these Indians in a car going down to Orlando. And my father stops by the side of the road to pick, there's this guy selling these clocks made out of sections of trees, cross sections of trees, which he's shellacked and made into clocks. And my dad pulls over to get this clock. And my heart is beating like this because I'm so afraid they're going to kill my dad. And then how am I going to get my grandfather, my uncle, who cannot drive, my aunt, who cannot drive, and I'm 10 years old. How am I going to get everybody home? I really was feeling like he's going to kill my dad, and I'm going to have to find a way to get my family back home. What am I going to do? And I was begging him, I was pulling on his arm, Daddy, please don't go get this clock. Please don't go get this clock. I don't think people sometimes understand the trauma that happens to children when they recognize that their world is not fair, not safe, not equal, and that there's something arbitrary that is happening that you really just don't have any control over. And it has something to do with your color or something, you don't know what it is. And that is something I wanted to leave with you, that there's trauma with this when we do this. Like, and I mean, also, yeah, what do you do? Like Matt and Salima said, like Kim said, you know, you shrug it off, you drive on, right? I had a roommate, I went to the University of Virginia in the mid 80s, super racist. And I came from here, which was not nearly as racist as Charlottesville. And I had a roommate who had two dogs, a black lab and a yellow lab. And the yellow lab was Pearl, and the black lab was called the N-word. And she has a picture of them, and I'm just like, oh, your dogs are so beautiful. And she says, oh yeah, that's blank and blank, you know? And she said that to me because I'm not black. So I'm sitting like on a fence between different people. So you hear what people say when you're not around, right? So white people talking to me and saying things to me because I'm not black. And then that was a real awakening. And like right now I work in this area of justice, of advocacy and justice, and definitely in the field of education. And Pastor Dore said something that I wanted to just respond to real quick. He said that the congregation, now my son was a Boy Scout, and the troop meets there in that church. I love that church, it's a beautiful church. And he had a beautiful Boy Scout family there, of Great Falls families, and very loving people. That is true. That I don't know whether they were members of the church. They were members of the Boy Scouts that met in the church. But you were saying how your congregation, largely social justice, very, focus on justice, but not necessarily economic stuff, right? And I just wanted to put out there that there is no justice without economic justice. Economic justice is also justice, So there's environmental justice, racial justice, social justice, economic justice. There's a lot of justice in all these fields, but really at the primary gravitational force of the universe is money. And so when you are not able to sort of understand the economic impact of racism, you've got another issue, which is more of a systemic thing, but I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Wow, such great presentations. I've gotten a few text messages from people I know who are in the audience, and they're just, I would say, very upbeat with the everything that you guys have said tonight. So just a little feedback there. We do have several questions here that have come in. I think are quite interesting. And Ed Phillips and Jennifer Falcone have been monitoring the line. Ed and Jennifer, do you want to place a question?
This is Ed. I had two questions that are very similar, but I'm going to go to the more simply worded question, and it came in at 7:57. There was one that came in about 5 minutes earlier than that, but I'll read the simpler one. Are there microaggressions you regularly observe in Great Falls that the white community members might be committing unknowingly? What are our blind spots? And it's open to any panelist.
Well, my daughter was called an octoroon at Forestville Elementary School. So there's that. She didn't hear it though, so that was just on me.
You might explain what that is, Sujatha. Not everybody will know.
An octoroon is a slave term that refers to 1/8 Black. It's like mulatto, quadroon, octoroon. It's like that, you know, because she's very, very light-skinned. My husband is African-American, but he's very, very light-skinned. And so is my mother, actually very, very light-skinned. So she has that kind of look, I guess. I don't know what an octoroon looks like, but I guess they thought it looks like my daughter. So that was one.
So I think part of the two questions Ed's referring to, there's this notion of, so when someone might say something that's inappropriate, how do you, and this is, I think Kimberly Greer touched a little bit on this, how do you deal with, what's the right way for that discussion to go on?
You mean that when someone does something like that, and how do you, what do you tell them?
Yeah, and maybe it's intentional, that maybe you deal with differently, but maybe someone says something that is still, that is, you deem perhaps is unintentional, but nonetheless having a racial bias to it. Is there a way to deal with that in the community like this?
Pastor Dore is trying to unmute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My experience, one of the things I have learned is that those who are really, you'll know the ones who are really being intentional, who just don't care. And the ones who are genuinely interested in addressing or making sure that they are being correct in what they say and so forth, are the ones who are going to really approach you and try to, or even in conversation, might say something and wonder, is this correct? Did I, you know, those are the ones I tend to really spend time talking with and just basically letting them know, you know, you're not being intentional by what you're saying. You're interested in learning something different. The ones who are intentional fully well know what they're saying, and you'll know who they are, and you deal with them accordingly. That's how I have handled those things in the past.
Sujatha, anything that comes out of your NAACP forums?
Oh, there are lots of things that come out of the NAACP forum, but let me just think about stuff that's pertinent to here. So let's just say about like systemic racism, and Mrs. Greer or Kim can talk, like, probably, I mean, this is never comfortable. It's never comfortable. But at Langley, there are very few African-American students. And I find myself in this position where being that I am not African-American, like I said, like sort of sitting on the fence between things, like sometimes I feel like I am in a much safer place to say things than, say, my daughter ever felt when she was at Langley. She never felt safe enough to really explain to people because she had to get through. And it was very traumatizing afterward when George Floyd is murdered and we're having racial forums. Langley, Mrs. Greer had one, Karen Keys-Gamarra had one, and Lila participated on those. And she would, write down the litany of stories and all of that. But it would make her cry. She would practice and it would make her cry. And she really very rarely broke down about it when she was in school. Because, what you would say is you get off the bus, you set your teeth, you go in, and you know that people are going to be pulling at your hair, commenting on your body, saying things like you're a slave, you don't have a father, you don't have any money, watch your stuff, they're going to take your stuff. And a long culture of that in FCPS, in all schools, everywhere. That's just part of like everybody, all of us have said, that's sort of part of it, right? You just sort of put your head down and get through. But those things have huge impact on your ability to relax and learn in school when you're always having to be a little bit worried because you can't tell your friends, or you've told them and they just don't think that that's a big deal. They're asking you to just, they're asking you to just move on. They're asking you, don't make that a big deal. Let me call you the N-word. It's called the N card. Can I have your N card? And if you give me your N card, then I can call you that word because I want to be cool like you, right? Or I want to be, and one could say, well, they're not using the N-word as an epithet, but the N-word is an epithet. So one should understand that when you're asking a child who doesn't really have a choice to give you that permission to call them something like that, it's much more than a microaggression. It really does impact your educational space and your head space.
Okay, so I have 2 at Langley and 2 graduated from Langley. Neither of them has ever said that they were called the N-word. I actually did ask them. I said, okay, so has someone called you a slur? Like, what's going on? Am I missing something? Because we don't always tell our parents. And they said, no, we haven't had any of those issues. And that's not to say that I don't pay attention. If someone says, teacher's difficult or whatever, my antenna's up just as a mother. So my kids have not had that experience at Langley. They did not walk around like stressed out and tense, because that to me, because I had that problem when I was bullied in elementary school. Yeah, every day at school, it was, okay, here we go. And it wasn't racial, but I didn't make it any more fun, and I got kind of the same thing first couple of years in junior high. I got a multiracial bullying experience, so it was a little bit different. And I gotta say, if school had been like that for my kids, I would have taken them out. And that's, it's easy to say when it's not your kid and you know people's situations, but just hearing you say that, like that's what your daughter went through, was just like, it's like it's stressing me out. And, my kids have never had that experience. Like I said, 2 graduated, 2 going through. They never had a problem. Like my kid's are biracial. Your kid is biracial. I don't know what she looks like. I've got 4. 3 of them are kind of light. One's closer to my color. I pay attention. We know the history of colorism in the Black community and the way white people have historically, if not in the present, although sometimes they do, treat people differently because they're lighter skinned. And I pay attention to that, and I just have not ever seen it. And someone mentioned something about,
I don't want to make it sound like my daughter wasn't happy there, because she did have very good friends of all different kinds, Black kids, Indian kids, white kids, all kinds of kids. She was, if she had been miserable and unable to thrive, then yeah. But yeah,
I'm not mom shaming, it's just, that was my immediate reaction. Because I actually homeschooled my kids when they were younger. And it was, partially a religious reason, but it's because when I educated my children, I don't want their first knowledge of Black people to be, slavery. No, we're going to start with the great civilizations of Africa. We're going to get that, foundation. And they learned about Mansa Musa. And they later learned that Mansa Musa was also a slave trader. I've taught all those things to them because I can't have them having a worldview that, you know, Black people were just hapless and helpless holy beings who were tricked by these super smart white people into subservience, because I don't think that's psychologically healthy. So, and I know I got that myself. My dad especially was super into like Black history. We used to go to seminars, we went to conferences, we had what few books were available at the time. So I don't concern myself. Someone asked about microaggressions. And when I say I don't care, I don't care. If someone cuts me off in line, which doesn't happen. So let me give you an example. Years ago, my husband and I were shipping presents to the post office. And there's a woman, she was a Black woman, African-American woman, as far as I could tell. And she had this like stat to her jaw, and she was really in a bad mood, having a bad day, whatever. And she kept like cutting in front of people and moving in front. And that does not upset me less because she was Black. And white people are not more important, that if they're sometimes slightly rude or having a bad day, that I need to carry that around because I don't care. That's just the way it is. That's the way I was raised. That's the way I raised my children. If someone's actually giving you a problem, then it's a problem. If they just don't like you. Rent in my head's really expensive. It's not easy to get in there. And I'll mute for now.
Well, let me chime in just a little bit. So my perspective, since I marry a Vietnamese woman, you know, my kids look like me, much more handsome, of course. But I
Your
teach
wife's
them to
jeans.
be Americans, right? I teach them and say, look, you're Americans. You're born here. You speak well. You don't have the Southern Vietnamese accent like me. And so you're Americans, period. And, you know, because the way you look, there's going to be a little bit of this, and you got to determine when to react to it. And go back to the microaggression comment. There are certain things that people say is obvious, right? It's just, you know, like the N-word. I mean, that's it, or whatever it was. It's pretty obvious, right? But then there were some that I think in the gray zone where they don't know how to react. They never met a Black person or Asian or whatever. They don't know how to deal with the situation. So it might come off incorrectly. And usually I tell my children, hey, you know, if you're not quite sure or you're uncertain, appeal to the noble motive. Ask, clarify. Don't assume that they're saying something that they're racist toward you. You know, if you're not quite sure, you want to verify, because you don't want to make your judgment call and, you know, do the wrong thing. As a matter of fact, I dealt with this, you know, sometime on a regular basis, and you know, turn out to be great friends. We actually joke about a lot of things where it's like, hey, you know, remember that time that you said something to me, like, you know, whatever. And because of that conversation, we became best friends and great partners and what have you. So it's all out there. You know, if you think you're a victim, you're always looking for ways to get into the mix of things. Whereas if you think you're Americans and appeal to a noble motive, then your life will be happier and your neighbors are better. They're not gonna, you know, and, you know, I like your thought about, you know, like, it's, look, okay, maybe he's one bad person out there that trying to say something to you or did something, but that's one out of what, 300 million people. So, you know, it's no big deal. You can make a big deal out of it, right? And you could, no big deal. But, you know, you appeal to a noble motive. And by doing that, by sharing that experience, you basically appeal to a larger audience. And they look at you and say, hey, you know, when they go low, you go high, right? Using that term. And that's how we get along. And frankly, one last point, I'm talking about Great Falls. I've never had experience, in fact, at all. In fact, I love Great Falls because there are a lot of diversity here. You don't see it because they don't come out and talk to you. All right. So that may be the downside of Great Falls. We're all kind of within ourselves and we're spaced out, you know, a couple, you know, acres apart. But I can tell you a lot of people that I interact with, and I dealt with political aspect and I do door knocks and what have you. I haven't found any, in fact, it's actually a lot warmer. And I say, oh, hey, welcome. I'm glad you're here. You made it, right? You lived the American dream. we'd love to hear more of you. And, I'm glad you're here and all of this. So look, there's some bad stuff out there and there are bad people, but overall, Great Falls, I mean, we love it and we're extremely happy here.
So,
And so on
now,
that,
go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to make what I think is a pretty important point. And that's the uniqueness of America, as far as I know, in civilizations, not only present, but past. We have an ideal in this country that we're not going to treat people differently and unequally, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. And all the progress we've made is by holding our leaders, cultural and political and otherwise, to those words, whether they believed it at the time, whether they thought it was, oh, this sounds pretty, because it wasn't always an option to have another monarchy. It wasn't always an option to enshrine permanently into law that it's ethnicity. It was always an option not to fight the Civil War over that. It was always an option to say, yeah, that stuff we said about equality, never mind. It was always an option to redo the Constitution. So I just want to acknowledge that we do have that as this culture. We do have a culture of self-reflection where the majority population will sit and will listen and say, hey, have I been doing something wrong? Am I screwing up? I read or heard earlier today that Saudi Arabia just banished slavery in the 60s. An African-American friend who moved to Saudi Arabia and found it to be kind of racist, and she is now back here. So I don't think that the Saud family is hosting seminars and webinars across Saudi Arabia to discuss their history of slavery and how they can be better. So I think we could take a second and just appreciate that we do have a culture of self-reflection and we do have ideals that we progress by trying to reach instead of just saying no.
So we are now at 8:32, which is almost sign-off time, and there are about a dozen questions in the queue. We're not going to ask them all. You can relax. But there is just one question, which I'd like to close on. This will be the closing question. And thank you all for sticking with us all evening. And like I said, for a remarkable discussion here in Great Falls. I know Sujatha has these discussions all the time, but the rest of us don't. So this is really very a step forward in some way. We're not sure how it's going to get applied, but the question I wanted to end on was from one of the people in the audience who wanted to know what other steps could be taken to increase understanding beyond this little program we had tonight. Does anyone have any specific comments they'd like to address to that? That's an audience question, and that'll be our last question.
I'll take a stab at it. One of the things I would suggest is getting out of one's comfort zone. Getting to meet somebody, who is different to you than you. Get involved in a way that your intention is to learn about others. Where I live, I'm not in Great Falls. I live here in Potomac Falls, in a very nice community. On one side of me is a very nice white family, and on the other side is someone I realized I went and took the initiative to introduce myself, and they're from Morocco. And I've had great relationships with these families. And I can only do that because I took that initiative to get to know them. And of course, living in this environment where you have, a Moroccan on my right and a white family on my left, allows me to be able to ask questions, to get involved, get to know them, they get to know me, put their guards down, those kinds of things. And that's how you get to get along with people. But if you're gonna stay in your own cocoon, not wanting to really get to be out there because you're afraid of the other person, then I think it's a cause for problems, simply because we have a notion that is not really that is not really true about the other person. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Pastor.
Can I say one thing? Just one
Please.
thing. And this is not really as a resident. This is just somebody who talks about race and justice. I really didn't come here today to talk about myself or I know that was what we were supposed to tell our personal story, so I told you a personal story. And my being, an immigrant child who born a first-generation American, and the fear that I felt really has certainly informed my life, no doubt about that. But I don't come into this space because of anything. I am a fairly safe person. I live in a fairly safe place. My children are doing well. They are healthy. They are, good looking. They're the ways that they are harassed are like they get by, they're okay. They're smart. They've done well in school. They've had access to all of our riches, all of the riches. My husband, we're both very educated people, and we have been able to bestow upon our children a very blessed life. They have all four of their grandparents, very lucky children. So I don't do this, and I don't speak about race because of anything really anymore about me. I am no longer really afraid. Though I was afraid as a child, I am not afraid. I'm a grown woman, and I am not afraid anymore. But any injustice for any one of us, right, that is systemic, it really is something that we should look at in a way that is comprehensive. And, I just don't do any of this because of what's happening to me, right? And because I may have particular interest, particular gifts, particular sense of duty to my community, to my larger community, to my nation, that absolutely did invite my father in here. My father then gave back. During the HIV/AIDS crisis, my father was one of the foremost. He's one of the founding HIV/AIDS researchers. So our blood bank, he invented the Western blot and ELISA test for AIDS. So our blood bank, the American blood bank, is safe because of my father. So they invited him here. He gave back quite a bit and raised his children, and I raised my children here. But we just can't. I really don't think it's not a question of whether we can brush it off if we have the capacity to do something larger and look beyond ourselves, because, my own ability to live well doesn't really mean very much if others around me are not living well. So.
Anybody else? Kimberly, if you want to add anything from the school perspective on that question?
No, I would just offer again, it's about just educating our children and helping them understand that when we consider how we are to be better. Academics is only one part of it. Anyone who hears me speak from an educational standpoint often hears me talk about the 4 C's, which are care, connect, celebrate, and commence. And, if you think about what those terms really encompass, only commence is something that we have a tendency to associate with academics, and in actuality, that word means beginning. And so for me, it's about making sure that we're raising young people who are good people, and the academics in a lot of ways are secondary, because as we all, I think would attest, that you can know everything in the world, but if you are not a kind-hearted person willing to look out for your fellow man, then it's all for naught. So I would just offer that really is what we need to be about when we consider what values we're instilling in our children. Yes, academics are important, but it's more important to really be someone who is looking out for the greater good of everyone.
Well, I can't imagine ending on a better note than that. Thank you, Principal. And thank you all tonight. If we were at the Grange or the library, there would be a large round of applause from the audience, which we can't hear tonight, I don't think, but I want to salute all of you for this kind of discussion. As I mentioned at the beginning, our speakers are normally government officials who come from the county or the state or somewhere, and we talk about the work that they do and so on and so forth. None of you are in that category. You're all you put your life on the line tonight in a way to have this kind of discussion, And I think it's very impressive that you were willing to do that. I know that there are many people in this community, because I've seen the feedback in the chat window tonight, who feel the same way. So anyway, this wraps up our program. And so I want to thank you all for that, unless anyone else has a final word.
Bill, can I say as well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. Thank you for that opportunity. I don't normally do it, you know, get in these kinds of discussions, but I felt that being a part of Great Falls and knowing what has been happening lately was a great opportunity to really share. So thank you for this opportunity as well.
So maybe we should all come to your church and sit in the front row sometime.
You know what? You're more than welcome to. In fact,
Socially distanced.
When we do come back, right now we are not. We are doing everything online, live streaming. But when we do come back, I'll be more than happy to have you guys come and worship sometime, for sure. Well, in fact, you know, I look for you. Good.
Thank you. Kind of a reunion. So anyway, I think we can all, everyone has, it's late and it's past we're 10 minutes beyond the time we'd allotted. So I also want to thank the audience. The audience has pretty much stayed with us this whole time. A few people have dropped off, probably for other commitments, but I want to thank all of you who came tonight to participate in this GFCA program. Our town halls, no matter how good our speakers are generally not very good if nobody shows up. So many thanks to all of you in the audience. I'm sorry we can't see you all tonight, but hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to meet again in the library or the Grange or somewhere else and actually see each other face to face. So with that, I say thank you and good night to one and all.